these styles are largely a reflection of how you've been treated in the past by close people, close others. And so it is functional at some level, at a big level, in fact, to be anxious if you never know where you have stood in the past with people. And you have to kind of constantly get reaffirmation that you're a worthwhile person that they're going to stay with. And avoidant people have experienced a lot of rejection in the past. They've not been treated well. I mean, you don't become avoidant just, out of the blue. You become avoidant or anxious based upon how you've been treated, sometimes by parents, sometimes by friends, sometimes by other close people in your life, prior romantic partners, etc. So these insecure styles are actually adaptive behavioral and emotional strategies to make the best situation, or make the best of a bad situation. And what the problem is, they bring these, once they're developed, they bring anxiety and avoidance into new relationships with new partners, and those new partners may not treat them badly. They may treat them well, but some of the vestige of that past comes into the current relationship.
Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to another episode of the Jeffrey Sarpong podcast. My guest today is Dr. Jeffrey Simpson, professor and the chair of the Department of Psychology at the University of Minnesota. Dr. Simpson is also one of the world's leading researchers on adult attachment theory and its role across lifespans. Dr. Simpson, welcome to the show.
I'm glad to be here. Thank you.
It's such an honor to speak to you today. But before we get into attachment theory, I want to just go back a little bit and give some context. So, what do relationships actually do for us, and why it is so important?
Yeah, relationships are very important, especially if we either don't have them or they're not good, if they're caustic. And so there's been a lot of research over the years that's looked at the impact of either being isolated, like being alone, either emotionally or physically, or being in a conflict habituated marriage, in on health, mental health and physical health, in relation to things that we know are bad for health, like smoking, for example, having insufficient money, stuff like that. And what's been found is that if you're in a bad, either if you're really isolated or you're in a really bad relationship, the implications for your mental and physical well-being are as bad as some of the vices that are known to be associated with bad mental health, and bad physical health.
Mm. And I've often seen attachment theory described as a lifespan theory. Can you get into that? What does that mean?
Yeah, it's a theory of personality and social development across life. And so what it basically means is that as we navigate through life, we have different kinds of close people who are what we call attachment figures, people we depend on for support and care. And sometimes it's reciprocal, like with adult romantic partners or close friends. And it's a theory basically that says as you navigate through life, you're going to experience different people who treat you in different ways, sometimes good, sometimes bad, sometimes indifferent. And these relationships shape the way you think about who you are and the world around you and how you relate to people. And they can change as a function of you changing, your partner's changing, um, doing different things as you develop as a person from being a child to an adolescent to an adult.
Mm. I'm so interested and excited to talk about this because a lot of my generation use these terms of attachment theory, anxious or avoidant. And I think they sometimes will lead us in the wrong way because we don't understand where they come
Right.
from. And so, yeah, I think this is why I'm so like, kind of like excited to speak about this. But another part of it is also is the role that, early childhood would have you as in your relational kind of relationship as you get older. Can you talk about it? What does it mean that your current relationships could be a result of something you experienced as a
Yeah.
child?
Yeah. When you say a result, you got to be careful about that because when we say that early experiences that you've had, let's say with your mom or your dad, are still associated with how you relate to, let's say, your current romantic partner, The effects are not large. They're small. They're maybe like 10% of, what basically you do in your romantic relationship is tied to how you were treated, either good or bad, by your father or by your mother. And so the idea here is that there are times when you're in a situation as an adult. I'll give you an example. You had a difficult relationship with your own parents when you were young, and you weren't treated necessarily very sportively or kindly all the time. Um, but you want to be, now that you are an adult, you want to be a good parent. You're motivated to be a good parent. You've taken parenting classes, you've got a good supportive partner. You're in a situation though when your child all of a sudden does something that reminds you of what you did when you were a child. And instantaneously you act like your parents did, which is not the way you want to behave. That's an example of how sometimes the past is carried into the present in situations that you just don't anticipate are going to happen, and they do. And you can correct that. You can, say, "Oh, I'm sorry I did that to you," but still it's there and it can potentially happen.
Okay, let's look at some of the kind of the ways this kind of plays out then. Let's start with definitional. I'm trying to get into what attachment styles are. So can you walk me through the four main attachment styles? What are they and what do they actually feel like from the inside?
Yeah, that's a good, very good question. Well, in the adult attachment area, there are four primary styles, and there's a fifth one, which is kind of a disorganized style, which we don't talk about much, but it is there. And so the four are being securely attached, being anxiously attached, being dismissively avoidantly attached, and being fearfully avoidantly attached. So secure people basically have a positive view of themselves as a relationship partners. They think they're good partners, good, trustworthy, dependable partners, and they have a positive view of their partners. And so it's a positive thing. And secure people basically they're very open and free, and they respond to what's in front of them, what their partners need. They're very likely to openly express what their needs are, and it's a nice reciprocal give and take. And they tend to be well adjusted. Secure people tend to have positive relationships. Their partners like them, and they tend to communicate effectively. Anxious people typically have a negative self view of themselves as partners, but more of a positive and hopeful view of other people. And so anxious people basically kind of doubt their self-worth, and they need a lot of reassurance. They ruminate about worst case scenarios that could happen. My partner might leave me if I do X, Y, and Z. And many times those situations never actually happen, but the rumination is what they act on. And so it makes them difficult to interact with, and they tend to have lower quality relationships because of that. Um, Dismissively avoidant people typically have a positive self view and a negative view of others, but their self view is kind of brittle. It can be broken down. They tend to think that they don't really need a lot of care and support. They like to be self-reliant and autonomous. They think that they don't need attachment relationships all that much, but actually they do. And so they tend to be more independent. They tend to um, want relationships on their terms, which makes them difficult to deal with, and thus their relationships aren't quite quite as well functioning as let's say secure people. Um, and then the final type is fearful, and they have a negative self view and a negative view of other people. And they kind of vacillate between what an anxious person looks like and what a dismissive, avoidant person looks like, depending on what's happening in a given period of time or period of situation. So fearful people basically have the worst of anxiety and some of the worst of avoidance, and they tend to have very, very unstable relationships that aren't very happy.
Let's take some of these one by one then. Starting
Yeah.
with the secure attachment. How much of the population would you say is and this attachment type?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, it's a bit debatable, but there are some general parameters, and it depends how you measure it.
Mm,
But in both children and in adults, in let's say North American cultures for the most part, and European cultures, about 60 or 65% of people are secure, and the other you know, 35, 40% are divided between the different types of insecurity, anxious, dismissive, avoidant, and fearful avoidant.
Yeah. And I think, as you mentioned, then is it like their way of dealing with people is positive? So that does that also like have a reflection of the mental state of how they kind of like look at the world?
Yeah, yeah. So secure people, um, for the most part, are optimistic. They're hopeful. They think they can work things out, and they are very good at communicating openly, expressing what they need from their partners and relationships, and being good at tailoring what they give to their partners. So secure people, for example, instead of just giving blanket support, will figure out what kind of support does my partner need right now, how much, when do I need to pull back and give them independence? When do I need to go in and kind of scaffold them, make them, feel like they have the efficacy to do something that's a challenge or a threat to them at a given time. And so, yeah, their communication style is to, just not assume that their partner needs kind of a generic response, but to pay a lot of attention, to listen, and then to um, allow their partner to be autonomous and do things on their own when they have gotten this felt security from this people who communicate security in the relationship.
Then is the goal for all of us to move towards secure attachment, or is there a misunderstanding of what that is?
That's a very good question. A lot of people in the field probably say, yeah, the goal is to be secure, and that's the goal of, let's say, couples therapy. What couples therapy basically is about is learning how to rebuild trust that's been broken with a partner and feel more secure with them in the relationship. So yes, the basic answer is yes, but there are people who are in situations in life where being secure makes you vulnerable, right? So if secure people trust others, and once they get burned a couple of times, they won't trust individual people, but they enter relationships typically being potentially vulnerable. And this is what makes them effective because their vulnerability allows them to build growth and closeness with people. But you can be in a situation, let's say you're in an environment where you can't trust people around you. And if you're secure or have a secure orientation toward people who might betray you, that obviously is not very functional.
And I think we'll get more into personality traits and the kind of how that affects. But yeah, I want to talk about the next one, that anxious attachment. So can you talk about what majority of the population would you just say is anxiously attached?
Yeah, I mean, the anxious, it depends on you measure, it depends on you define, but probably about 10 or 15% of adults are anxiously attached, approximately. So it's not a real common thing. But what makes it difficult is that um, anxious people, because they don't feel secure, they tend to sometimes smother their partners. They, and then they worry about what could happen if. This rumination is a real problem. And so if you're a partner of a person who's anxious, you're constantly trying to reassure them, make them feel like you truly do love them, but they don't always accept it. And so you're continually having to reassure, which burns partners out basically. Um, and so anxious people, oftentimes a lot of the relationship is in their head through the perceptions that they have of either what has happened. Then they can sometimes have a negative slant. Oh, my partner told me they love me, but they really don't mean it, or they did it because they want to get something from me, as opposed to my partner really does love me, which is a very, very security inducing feeling that anxious people oftentimes don't have. So they basically are very challenging to deal with. In fact, in some ways, they're the most challenging type of insecure person because they're always needing reassurance.
Mm, mm. And so if someone is anxious and they were with someone who's, I say, for example, avoidant, which comes to the next one now, how would that dynamic play out?
That's a bad dynamic. That's the one because the needs are that anxious and avoidant people have in the context of relationships are very different. It can lead to what's called a demand withdrawal pattern that you see sometimes in couples. So this pattern is when one partner demands something or really wants something from the other, and the other partner withdraws because they either like the status quo or they can't deliver what the person wants or they feel awkward delivering what a person wants. And so anxious people are motivated to uh, be close, spend a lot of time together, and feel greater security in the relationship. Avoidant people, they are more motivated to be self-reliant. Uh, they value relationships, but they want them to be on their own terms, which oftentimes involves more, I wouldn't say distance. Well, it could sometimes be physical distance or emotional distance, but more space to be the kind of person I want to be, and then to kind of like engage when they feel ready to engage on their terms.
Okay, taking a step back now, because a lot of my friends would tell me if they are anxious or avoidant, that they feel there is something wrong with them, especially anxious attachment. They feel like they're broken or damaged or there's something wrong with them. Is that the right way to view that attachment style?
Yeah, I think that's the wrong way to view it. I mean, initially, when the theory was being tested, basically. The assumption was that if you were insecure, that was problematic. But these styles are largely a reflection of how you've been treated in the past by close people, close others. And so it is functional at some level, at a big level, in fact, to be anxious if you never know where you have stood in the past with people and you have to kind of constantly get reaffirmation that you're a worthwhile person that they're going to stay with. And avoidant people have experienced a lot of rejection in the past. They've not been treated well. I mean, you don't become avoidant just out of the blue. You become avoidant or anxious based upon how you've been treated, sometimes by parents, sometimes by friends, sometimes by other close people in your life, prior romantic partners, etc. So these insecure styles are actually adaptive behavioral and emotional strategies to make the best situation, or make the best of a bad situation. And what the problem is, they bring these once they're developed, they bring anxiety and avoidance into new relationships with new partners, and those new partners may not treat them badly. They may treat them well, but some of the vestige of that past comes into the current relationship.
You mentioned that these styles are adaptive. What do you mean by that?
I mean, they're adaptive in that they allow a person to regulate their emotions as their negative emotions as best they can. They're adaptive in that they protect people from perhaps being taken advantage of by people who either really don't care for them or have ulterior motives that don't include them. And so adaptive that's a good question actually, because adaptive can mean different kinds of things in different contexts. And here what we're talking about is, from their own personal standpoint, it's sort of a way to protect the self, to make sure that you aren't taken further advantage of in new relationships, given what you've experienced in the past.
I think that also brings me to another point, that is this nature or nurture. If it's something that we adapt in our environment to kind of be able to understand our environment, or is it something that we're kind of born with? Where do these styles actually come from?
That's another very good question. I mean, initially, the primary developers of the theory thought it was largely based upon environmental experience and not genetics, for example. Um, and some of the early research, and this is still ongoing, indicated that attachment styles have a very, very small genetic component, and it's mainly you basically become secure if you've been treated well in the past by attachment figures, and you become insecure if you've been treated in an unpredictable way, that's anxiety, or in a rejecting way, more consistently rejecting way, that's avoidance. But there is some new evidence coming out with larger genetic studies to show that maybe the genetic component for some of the styles is a little bit larger than negligible. But even those studies are showing that most of the underlying source of it is actually how you've been treated, as far as I can tell in the current literature. So
Mm.
there's a little genetic component to it, especially for anxiety, it looks like. Not so much for avoidance, um, but it's primarily a function of, again, how you've been treated, or how you represent in your head how you've been treated. That's an important point because what happens is don't remember a lot of what happens to you as a child, especially before you have the ability to remember things. And what you're doing as an adult is you're thinking about what was my childhood like. So you're creating a representation in your head of it that may or may not be accurate. And usually it's a combination of what actually happened and stuff that you've inferred that may either might have happened or may not have happened, or may not have happened in the way that you remember. And so that's another part of it too, is the we call those working models. They're kind of like schemas or attitudes in your head, expectations that you have about how you are likely to be treated given how you've been treated in the past.
That's a very good point, and I want to stay here for a while. So you mentioned specific experiences. What are some of the specific experiences in early life that if you went through this, it could be that you would turn out with this attachment style? And I know it's kind
Yeah.
of like you mentioned, it's different for everyone, but is there some experiences that someone listening could kind of like relate to that would give us some
Yeah,
context?
yeah, yeah. I think, well, that's another excellent question. What Bowlby talked about is, Bowlby was the developer of attachment theory back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. What he talked about were experiences that were traumatic, or were difficult. So, when you felt overly challenged, when you were ill, when you felt threatened, especially when you were vulnerable. And so the idea, and I think this is probably true, is that when a person is distressed at any age and needs soothing and needs to be, you know, feel more secure, what did that caregiver, be it a mother or a father or a close friend or an adulthood romantic partner, how did they handle that, right? How did they handle it? Were they able to effectively soothe you? Were they able to kind of give you the confidence that you needed once you were soothed to go out and live your life in the world? Those were probably the primary events, early on in life, that shaped the way you relate to other people later on. And so, for example, be real concrete. Let's say that you had a parent who, whenever you would get hurt at a young age, 5, 6, 8, um, their attitude was, suck it up, shake it off, um, you know, take care of it, as opposed to, oh, what happened? Let me take a look. Tell me how it happened. Here, I'll do some stuff to make you feel better, both physically and emotionally. Those are very different ways that parents may relate to kids, and that sticks with people. That sticks with people. And so if you were told to suck it up, you become self-reliant. You become avoidant, usually. If you were attended to and you were given good support, you learn that that's what you're supposed to do when people are hurt and they come to you for support. And so it's modeling kind of. Modeling is part of of the behavioral pattern, um, that links the past to the present.
It's fascinating, so fascinating how parenting styles and attachment styles often link. I want to
Mhm.
now kind of like, before I move on to the study they did, the longitudinal study, the
Yeah.
question I'm thinking listening to this is that can someone actually change their attachment style, or is it something that they're stuck with after they develop?
Oh, yeah. Bowlby's idea was that it was they could change. What he called what he did is he said that there are people who provide what he called goal-corrected partnerships. And the whole idea behind therapy, by the way, is that you can change. You can change. There still could be vestiges of insecurity even after successful therapy, but you can learn to trust people. you can learn to support them and request support in a more effective way based upon what you need. And so, yeah, these styles do and can and do change. And in fact, we've studied some of this in our work. We've tried to figure out what are some of the things that or some of the variables that allow people to change. And one of them, a primary one, is having the right partner. So if you let's say you're an insecure person, um, and you get involved in a relationship with someone who's secure, and so they're the way they think about the world is that I'm going to be there for you unconditionally. I am going to do what you need. I am going to be attentive, and I'm going to not smother you, but I'm going to scaffold you in a proper way. Over time, if you're with that person, you gradually become more secure. And so that's one primary form. Also, you can um, be put in situations or inner situations that show you it's okay to be vulnerable or it's okay to give support. So, for example, one of the things that we've done is we've looked at how the transition to parenthood, how having a baby affects of people who start out as avoidant. So if you're an avoidant parent, you don't like avoidant people, for example, don't like body contact. They don't like to be touched. They want to kind of like, be their own independent person and have control of things. But when you're a parent for the first time, all of a sudden you're in a role that you can't kind of escape from. And you have to take care of somebody, a child, a baby, an infant that's vulnerable and needs a lot of body contact. And what we found in our work is that people who start out as being avoidant vis-a-vis their romantic partner become less avoidant across the transition when they are basically required to spend a lot of time taking care of their child and having contact with them, body contact, emotional contact, etc. And they learn basically that okay, you know, being a supportive person actually isn't as autonomy limiting as I thought it would be. But they wouldn't figure that out unless they were forced to be in a situation that they couldn't escape from. And that's kind of one way to think about parenting.
Could you mention the study that you did that you were part of? Could you speak a little bit more about that? What was the study trying to find out? What was the kind of the I know that it was from birth to late 20s, but yeah, what else did
Yeah,
you
yeah,
find
yeah.
in that study?
Yeah, this study came out actually earlier this year. I think it was in January of 2026. And so, what we did, and I say it, we as a royal we, I certainly was only one member of a bunch of people who were involved. Data was collected from the time people were about 3 years old across time to the top time they were about 30. And in this study, it's a longitudinal study in the United States. 1,100, approximately 1,100 families, including a target child, um, were studied across time. So every couple of years, the team would go in and they would measure things, all kinds of things, but some things that were relevant to attachment theory, like the quality of care that the child got from mom and dad, like what was happening in the classroom, rated by their teachers in elementary school. How sociable were they? Yeah, how much did they rely on their same age peers for support? And then the measures were collected on their adolescent friends and then on their romantic partners. And so these are all attachment type relationships, right? And we were looking at the quality of the interactions and different kinds of things. And what we found basically was this is not too much of a surprise, but it's been now documented on 700 people followed across 30 years, is that the quality, especially the quality of the relationship that you have with your mother, is really important in predicting the quality of your relationships with romantic partners, with friends, with people who are your adult attachment figures. Um, Fathers weren't as predictive. In fact, they weren't very predictive, but we think it's because of the role that fathers play with children, which is a little bit different than it is with mothers, especially early in life. Um, we also found that the trajectory of your relationships makes a difference. So, for example, if You might have started out with your a poor relationship, let's say your mother, but it got better as you entered the teenage years, that also predicted better functioning in your romantic and friendship relationships. And the other thing that we found that's really important, I think, and this is something that we did not we sort of anticipated it, but we didn't know it'd be quite this strong, is the quality of your friendships in adolescence is also very important in predicting the quality of your romantic relationships and your friendships later in life. And we think this is important in part because with friendships compared to, let's say, parent-child relationships, it's more of a reciprocal thing. It's more of an equal status thing, and you have to negotiate them. When you're in a relationship with your parent or parents when you're young, it's more of a hierarchical thing. Your parents are older and wiser, and they have more knowledge, etc. And it's more of a top-down process, not entirely, but partly. With friends, you have to learn how to negotiate friendships. You have to learn how to, figure out how to support each other and things like that. And so having a really secure group of network of friends when you're, let's say, 15, 16, 18, that also is really important in setting you up for security later in life.
That's such a fascinating study, and I think there's so much to unpack there. But first off, you mentioned obviously teenage and adolescence and the importance of that time. Was that also the time when the attachment style showed up more obviously? Let's say, like it was obvious that this person was a anxious attachment, or it was obvious this person was a because of the relational. What was the when was the time where we could see that the attachment style
Yeah.
kind of taking root?
Well, that's a really good question. I mean, you could see it, you can see it in some respects more easily when people can report it. So obviously, a young child may or may not be able to report, whether or not they feel like they have avoidant tendencies or anxious or secure. But you can definitely do that when a child's, let's say, in middle school or high school or certainly beyond. And so, one of the things that in this study, we were able to kind of see it when we could get the reports from, I mean, really see it when we could get the reports from the actual adolescents themselves. And so that may be another reason why that period was important because they understood and had enough experience in relationships to know how they related to other people and they could then report it.
I think that's matches up with my kind of anecdotal experience too, or me and my audience, my friends, because there is well, right when you get to that age of your life, the relational aspect starts to matter. Then you start to kind of self-reflect on how you react to that. So if you're
Exactly.
reacting, yeah, to a friend a certain type of way, you understand that, and then maybe you don't have the ability to connect it to your childhood, but you definitely understand the difference there.
Yeah, you definitely do. You definitely do. Yeah, but anyway, the reason why this I think the study was important was because it was the first big study, 700 people, with really good measures at the right points in development across time to document how earlier events or earlier relationships were correlated with adult outcomes. And so we were able to kind of, document some things that had been long-standing assumptions in attachment theory, like the primacy of the maternal relationship. And again, we think the maternal relationship is important because in our society, um, given socialization practices, most of the people who are taking a lot of care of children in terms of time and in terms of effort, especially early in life, are mothers rather than fathers. That's changing as society changes, but this study again started in about 1990, and there have been changes since 1990 in terms of gender roles and things like that. Um, so yeah, I think it was an important demonstration of the fact that there is an enduring legacy there from early experience. Again, it's only accounting for about maybe 10 or less percent of the outcome. So again, this goes back to your question of can it change? It does change. We can see it changes because the correlations between early maternal quality and your security in your romantic or friendship relationships, the correlations account for about 10% of the outcome. The other 90% is due to other factors or it's due to error of measurement, basically. So that other 90% is really powerful. And we think that what accounts for those that other 90% is the other experiences that you have with different people that either do or don't replicate what your mother or father did earlier in life. And that brings in the lifespan view of attachment. That is a continuing, you're continually changing the way you think about who you are as you have more experiences with more people.
On the topic of change, then, is it purely relational? Can someone change their attachment style by themselves with like self, I guess therapy or like, self-reflection? Or is it something you have to kind of develop in someone else?
Well, it's another very good question. I'm sure there are individually based therapies that can get have people gain insight into why they might be insecure, and I'll help them once given that insight become more secure. But for according to attachment theory, a lot of it depends upon the reciprocal relationship you have with your partner or your primary partners. And so I think some of the most effective therapies are dyadic ones or relational ones, where the two partners are in therapy together and they're talking about, the past traumas they've experienced, either with each other or with other people, and they're taught how to soothe and comfort and support each other in a way that their partner needs and that they feel comfortable giving. And you'd be surprised. I mean, here's one thing that's really interesting, I think, about a lot of this, a lot of this work. So we go to school for years and we're taught how to do math. We're taught how to, write properly, speak properly, etc. But how much formal education do we get about how to be a good partner, how to support people, how to be a good parent? I mean, those are really important things that we just assume you can pick up on your own through living or through talking with your friends or your peers about what to do. And that is kind of a mistake because there's a lot that can be learned without having to go through a lot of trial and error and tribulation, by just learning more about what makes a person a good supportive partner, what makes someone a good supportive parent, etc. And
Mhm.
I've always been kind of mystified by that because there's a lot of concern that, we have a lot of problems in society and we can't fix them, we can't afford to fix them. Well, there are some things you can do that aren't really expensive by giving people information or training, kind of like what your podcast is doing, um, just so that they're aware of these things or they're aware of where they can go to learn more before they enter a bad relationship.
Absolutely. I think my generation is the test case for this, that we've grown up without none of these kind of pointers or information about what to do in relations. And so we're finding it very hard to kind of like, build these things. And I think that's
Yep.
why, so I mentioned before, that's why I started this podcast to try to get people to understand more. But it's also for myself to kind of understand more about, relationships in the world out there. Coming back to you
Mhm.
mentioned about relationships and attachment style. How does attachment show up in romantic relationship? Let's talk about that now in a day to day. So before we talked about anxious and avoidant, but
Mhm.
in other types of relationships, how does attachment show up?
It shows up in patterns of communication, whether either you feel that you can freely disclose things or whether there are topics you have to avoid or you have to circumvent or dance around. It shows up in the extent to which can genuinely be happy about your partner's success, or you feel threatened by it, or you feel awkward about talking about it. It shows up in expressions of gratitude or lack thereof. You know, um, are you in a relationship where you let your partner know when they've done something that you really appreciate? And do they reciprocate that gratitude? Or do you kind of like say, we know we love each other. We don't need to talk about that. We don't need to kind of daily express that we or thank our partner for doing something. Um, It also shows up just in the way we support. I mean, sometimes what people will do is they will say instrumental support, giving you advice, helping you get things done is all I need to do, when in fact, partners need emotional support too. And they may or may not. So, for example, avoidant people usually prefer instrumental support. They want to fix the problem, they want to move on, but they don't like emotional support unless they really are in a bad situation. Whereas anxious people, the first thing they want is not instrumental support. They want to feel heard and cared for. They want emotional support. And so you see it in patterns like that. What secure people do in that situation is they say, I'm not going to assume that I understand what my partner needs unless I attend to them right now, at this moment, in this situation. And then I will determine what I do. I will wait and not just adopt a general strategy, give instrumental support, blah, 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 give emotional support, blah, blah, blah. It's more of what do I need to do and how to do it? Do I need to tailor it to what my partner needs? And so these reflect or translate into different patterns of reciprocal interaction between people. And you can watch videotapes, for example, of couples talking about things, if you have seen enough of them, and you can know basically what the attachment styles of each partner are, usually by just looking at how they talk for 10 or 15 minutes about an important issue.
Mm. And then apart from secure attachment, are there other attachment styles which work together? So would an anxious work with an anxious attachment, or would a fearful work with fearful? Or is it like only secure attachments really work in relationships?
That's a good question. We don't know a great deal, or we don't know as much as we should about pairings. And what's interesting is that the original attachment theory never really talked about should certain pairings matter. There have been extensions of the theory, and we now know that, for example, anxious and avoidant folks don't mix very well. We also know that we haven't talked much about this, but there's a pattern called disorganized. And disorganized people basically have experienced extreme trauma in their lives, to the point where they don't have a strategy. So the insecure styles that we're talking about, anxious and avoidant, they have a strategy of how to regulate their emotions, how to deal with the world. It may not look optimal, but it is sort of functional and adaptive. Disorganized people don't have a strategy. I mean, because they've been traumatized and they don't have a plan. And those people basically have really, really difficult relationships because their partners just don't know how to deal with such a moving target, right? Or to an unpredictable target. Maybe that's a better way of putting it, because you can be a moving target and still be predictable, right? Um, so um, the secure pairing is going to probably be, it is the most stable pairing, and you're going to see the most adaptive, good functioning in those kinds of relationships. But other pairings with secure people can also work. So, for example, one example, a secure person with an avoidant person. A secure person may realize the only way I can soothe them is to do it kind of indirectly and subtly, and not make them feel like they're being controlled. And I will find a way to make it work and allow them to regulate their emotions in a way they feel comfortable. And I will learn to accept that in the relationship. And if they come to that conclusion, a secure person and an avoidant person can be pretty stable and actually can be pretty happy. And the same can be true with security and anxiety. But the secure person has got to be the one, I think, that realizes that they need to tailor what they do a little more to their partner than vice versa in order for the relationship to work.
I want to now talk about kind of like an updated kind of the current relational, let's say, environment. So a lot of my generation is kind of forming relationships through technology and through online and all these kind of new systems. What does attachment theory say about how this affects us?
That's a that's a 64,000 or whatever now dollar question. And in fact, the work is just starting to come out on, to what extent can AI or AI assisted therapy actually work. A hardcore attachment person would probably say there might be situations in which it can provide a sense of safety and security and certainly information, good information to people who need it. But a hardcore attachment theorist probably would say, in the end, nothing quite matches connection, touch. Touch is a really important thing. This is something that AI, at least right now, unless you had talking about like a robot type situation, really can't do. But touch can be miraculously important in soothing and connection and support. And that is where I think the face-to-face contact may be really important. Not to say that AI can't do certain things. Um, it can, but it may not be a complete answer to the what people need in the end.
I think it's also still very new. We're still figuring out exactly what it means both ways, right?
Yep.
What it means for a certain attachment style to be dealing with AI. If AI is always kind of there to will be there and soothe you, the
Right.
avoidance might find it, or the anxious might find it okay.
Right. And here's another problem with that. To grow, sometimes you need to be told things aren't always good. You're not always doing the right thing. Maybe you need to change. Um, and that's what secure people will do. Secure people will sometimes challenge their insecure partners or their secure partners and say, yeah, I don't think you're viewing that situation the right way. Or maybe there's another way to react to this. And AI right now, that most of the programs are designed to make people feel good and hear what they want to hear. And that doesn't always allow people to change in a positive way or for relationships actually to grow because sometimes growth in relationships requires, you know, working things out, making corrections that downstream that may feel painful in the immediate moment, but downstream are going to make your relationship better.
Yeah. I think this leads perfectly on to my next question, which is about the way attachment styles make us see ourselves. How does attachment shape the way we see ourselves, not just the way we relate to others?
There's less work on this actually, and a lot of it is more anecdotal. But one thing I do know is that people who are anxious know they're anxious. They know they're anxious. They know they ruminate at times. They know that they can smother their partners. They know that they need a lot of reassurance, and they admit it. Avoidant people, not necessarily. There are some avoidant people, especially more dismissive avoidant people, who think they're secure. I'm fine. I'm happy with who I am. I'm happy with what I have. What do you mean I have to have, more emotional support? What do you mean I have to spend more time connecting with my partner? I'm happy where I'm at. And so they don't have as much insight, I don't think, typically, we're talking in general terms here, about who they are in the context of relationships, at least close relationships. Secure people, I think a lot of them do have a lot of insight. One of the things about being secure is that you don't have to think about attachment kinds of things quite as much because you just are reacting to what's in front of you. You aren't worried about losing your partner. You aren't worried about being betrayed. You aren't worried about being smothered or losing your independence. And so secure people this is a little ironic, they are focusing on other life tasks beyond attachment because they're just kind of working it out and they've got it. Things are going well with their partner. They are assuming in an optimistic way that the best is going to happen and they work to kind of achieve those goals. And so sometimes I think secure people, if you ask them that question, they haven't thought a whole lot about it because they haven't had to deal with attachment issues. They haven't had to, deal with the same kinds of struggles that anxious and avoidant people have had to deal with.
Fascinating insight. Is there any correlation between personality traits and attachment styles?
Small, small. So, for example, there's a I'm not sure if all of your listeners know this, but there's a thing called the Big Five personality traits. And there's a debate about there's a five or there's six or seven, but there's consensus that it's close to some number like that. And there are some traits that tend to correlate 0.20, 0.25, which is small, with security. So people who are secure tend to be more agreeable. They're more agreeable in general across relationships and across time. People who are anxious tend to be a little bit more neurotic. Um, Again, these correlations are not big, and they're small enough that the attachment um, measures are considered independent constructs from the personality measures. But there is a little bit of overlap. Sometimes avoidant people are a bit more disagreeable or on these big five measures. So there is a bit of overlap, but it's not large.
That's very surprising to me because as we're talking, as we're discussing, it does feel like there is some, like you talk about anxious and being neurotic. It does feel like there is some correlation. Is there a reason why there isn't any correlation at all? Is it more life experience that brings that into
That's a
play?
really good question. I think it has to do with, I think people in their mind partition close relationship experiences and my experiences in general with people in life, strangers, casual friends, etc. And I think they kind of in their mind it's kind of one way to think about it is that those close relationships are kind of tagged separately from you know what are people like in general. And I think so there's a little bit of overlap because close relationships are also part of the personality portfolio of agreeableness and neuroticism, but they include a lot of other types of relationships. And people may have had very different experiences with their casual friends than, let's say, their parents or their close friends. Or they may have different kind of conceptualizations of strangers based upon the media or based upon, you know, cultural experiences that are at odds with, how they were treated by their mother or their close friend when they were in high school, things like that. So that's my best guess, but that's a speculation.
Thank you for that. You've talked about a concept called earned security. Could you tell us a bit what that means and also how does it actually happen?
Yeah, it's a concept that comes out more of developmental psychology, and the idea is that there are some people who early in life, especially with their parents, have insecure attachment patterns. So they're either avoidant or they're anxious or they may be disorganized even. Um, but they have these corrective partnerships later in life. It could be with teachers, if they're very, very close to a grade school teacher or a set of teachers, or it could be mentors, or it could be close friends or romantic partners. And these corrective partnerships make them realize you don't have to assume that everyone's going to treat you badly or treat you in a negative way. And so they have learned through these later experiences that they can be secure, and they've earned it because they've had to kind of rework the way they think about who people are. It does not mean that they're necessarily that their insecurity later on is completely gone, because that depends on their memories and how they represent things as an adult when thinking back on their past. But what it does mean is that um, those experiences are still probably there at some level. And this may explain why, when you look at earned secure people compared to people who have never had insecurity, earned secure people, they are better than being in a traditional insecure person, but they're not quite as happy and functional in their relationships later on as someone who's been secure all the way along. So they're kind of in the middle. And this is kind of like, but this is what you see with the outcome of therapy often. If a person's major issue is, I can't trust my spouse, I have been cheated on by my close friends. Um, they basically, if therapy works well, they've learned to let some of that go and learn to trust people a little bit more. And it's been earned, but those experiences are still there.
I think it also speaks to how by understanding the frameworks of these kind of theories, it can help you on the path to change. I think yeah, that's another question I had for you. How important is it that once you understand these frameworks, like we're talking about, if you understand you're an anxious person, you kind of understand what habits and what traits that mean. How important is that to actually begin in the process of changing?
I think it's critical. I think it's critical to have objective, clear, straightforward self-insight about who you are. Um, Another thing to think about is that a lot of people, I mean, you do compare yourselves to other people, but you're not in the head of other people, and you don't know exactly what they're thinking in a given situation. So this insight can sometimes do is it allows you to see different ways that people think about the meaning of situations. So let's take an anxious person. Um, their partner genuinely cares for them. They really do. And they're trying to find a way to express it to the anxious person so they can feel more secure and be less anxious, right? But the anxious person doesn't accept it. If you expose the anxious person to other people who are kind of viewing the same situation and know the partner, they may be able to say, yeah, this is a genuine expression of care and support, and here's why. And once they see other people saying, yeah, I mean, I really do think your partner does love you. And, when I've had experiences like this, it's been genuine. That can allow people to begin to realize maybe I'm not thinking about this the right way.
Mm. Final question I have, and I want to aim this at my listeners and my viewers. If you could give my generation one understanding from 40 years of research, would actually help them build better relationships and a better inner life, what would it be?
I think actually a kind of a couple. One is choose your partners well. We oftentimes get into relationships, be it with friends or romantic partners, for reasons that may be good in the short term, but not good in the long term. So, and what I mean by that is that a lot of what makes a relationship stable and happy are things that are hard to see when you first meet someone. Like, how compatible am I with this person, really? Um, how truly trustworthy across time is this person? Does this person have the same values that I have? It's hard to see some of those things when you first start dating someone or when you first meet a potential friend. So, but if you can identify people who you're compatible with, who share your values, and who are secure, um, your life is probably going to be easier because those people are going to be able to work with you and find ways to make you and your relationship more stable and happier.
Mhm. Dr. Jeffrey Sarpong. Dr. Jeffrey Simpson. I'm Jeffrey Sarpong. I get confused out
It's the
there.
meeting of the Jeffries.
Is there this has been incredible, super insightful. Thank you so much for your time. If people want to let's listen to more about, your work and your study, where can they find you?
They can go to my website, the University of Minnesota. If you just go to the Department of Psychology at the University of Minnesota, you'll be able to see where my website is. Again, I want to thank you for giving me the chance to talk about this stuff. I've spent a lot of time, thinking about these issues, and it's really gratifying that the work is getting out there to the public. One of the frustrations that I have, and I don't mean to belabor this,
Mm,
but a lot of the information that's out there on attachment is not accurate. There's there's attachment theory in the scientific literature, and then there's some concepts of attachment that are very different than that. And what we've been talking about and the questions you've been asking are the more scientifically based attachment work, which is important to get out to the public.
I completely agree. I think that's why I reached out to you, and thank you for the work that you do. Honestly, like you doing the research for this really taught me a lot about the field, and making me way more fascinated and interested, and self-reflective even, during this
Right.
process. So thank you so much for your
Exactly.
time again today.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you.